Welcome, this is Mara and Ben for Stellarstrategygaming, and today we're going to be talking about the Goblin and Kobold playable races. Now these are some iconic bad guys, usually just some pop-up and splat type bad guys from D&D history, but Wizards has filled out their history, their lore a little bit, and given them some interesting abilities as playable races.
Yes, first off, they've really made sure that there is now a difference between the two, which we'll go into a bit later. But in previous editions, I will say that one of the similarities was that they were both mammalian creatures, and in fact, there were half kobold, half goblin things, which were basically just goblins plus. And so, if you come from fourth edition and have not played fifth, you might think, oh, well, a kobold is just a goblin. Whereas now, kobolds are lizard people, and goblins are not that. But on top of that, there are some striking similarities, however, which is that, first off, both are small creatures who tend not to live up to their maximum potential in life. One of the things that I see is the kobolds can live on the order of 130 years, I believe, which means that, theoretically, you could have a wizard kobold who is more experienced than the most experienced human could ever be. And I think that there's actually something similar to be said about goblins, whereas it says the average lifespan in the books, which makes me think that part of that is just due to goblins not having the greatest of living conditions. If you gave them a beautiful mansion on a hill and everything they needed to survive and made sure they worked out every day appropriately and such, I would think that they could probably live at least similarly to humans. The only reason why I'd think not is perhaps just because they're a bit smaller. So with both races, I really do think that they don't live up to their potential fully. They benefit from their small size and large numbers, especially. They're definitely both pack hunters, and also their pantheon while there are some differences, their pantheons actually are kind of similar in how they work, but I'll let Ben discuss why he disagrees with me on that.
So yes, as stated, Wizards did do a pretty good job of establishing the differences between the two races. The biggest difference, I would say, even though they're both classified as either lawful evil or neutral evil, it's a different kind of attitude, it's a different kind of evil. Kobolds recognize their small status and their physically small status and the fact that they're not the most magical people in the world. Their god, Kurtlemock, was trapped in a maze by the gnome god Glittergold. And the result of this is that kobold clerics are exceedingly rare because Kurtlemock can't reach out to them. So that limits their magical potential. Wizard kobolds are exceedingly rare. It's not really ever explained in the lore that I know of, other than the fact that because they're so physically weak, it's hard for them to establish the kind of lasting kingdoms that would allow them to establish libraries and so forth. They do have a strong connection to dragonkind, and as a result, draconic bloodline sorcerers are not hugely uncommon among kobolds, or at least not more uncommon than they are among, say, humans. Kobolds, in recognizing their diminished stature, they do tend to try to find ways to latch on to something bigger than them, especially dragons. And in some versions of the lore, kobolds will even spontaneously come into existence around dragons, which is a great statement on the power of dragonkind, that these small sentient beings just pop into existence to serve them. Kobolds do rely on their numbers, but they also rely on a lot of subterfuge. They like to burrow into lairs and set traps and hide, and if they attack in massive swarms. Goblins are very different. Goblins remind me a lot of a dog I had when I was a kid. This dog was a Pomeranian. He weighed about 10 pounds, and he was very loving to me and my immediate family. To the rest of the world, he was 10 pounds of teeth and evil intentions. Goblin kind are like that. They are aggressive to anything that's not their own kind. They even have a specific ability called Fury of the Small. When you damage a creature with an attack or a spell, and the creature's size is larger than yours, you can use the attack or spell to deal extra damage to the creature. The extra damage equals your level. Once you use this trait, you can't use it again until you finish a short or long rest. So basically, goblins will serve stronger creatures like hobgoblins or drow or almost anything that they can sort of survive under. But when they get a chance to lash out, they will do so as hard as they possibly can. And goblins are much more aggressive, whereas kobolds tend to be content to burrow into their lairs and or serve the dragons they serve. Goblins are much more aggressive. They're nomadic raiders. I'm going to go ahead and let Mara get a little bit more into the differences between these races.
Yes, and for one, there is definitely, I will say just from a history standpoint, the goblins are very, this is not a word that would be associated with most of them, they are very organized by comparison to kobolds. I actually commented on this earlier, possibly in a different vid even, but goblins and every goblinoid species are specifically designed to fit in a certain position in an army. I do not personally think that that army is alignment bound by any means, but they are specifically, goblins are clearly the berserkers, the front lines, whereas hobgoblins are sort of the sub-commanders that direct that fury and so on and so forth, which really does get back to their history, which is that their god killed all the other ones, and so they're quite literally building an army to kill their own god. But on top of that, it also feeds into their fury of the small, because it feeds into that idea of the berserker going out and just sort of killing everything in a 5-foot radius.
One difference I would like to point out between the two that's significant is the kobold god Kurtlemock does want to interact with his people. He just can't, and the kobolds know that. In the goblins' pantheon, their god, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, he doesn't care about them, and they know he doesn't care about them, which makes cleric goblins exceedingly rare. So they have a similar problem as the kobolds, where they're not a magical people. They don't have that to make up for their size the way, for example, gnomes do. You've also got to think about how that is going to affect the mentality of a goblin, how that affects their sense of self-worth. You know for a fact that God is real. You know for a fact that there's a specific God of your people. And you know for a fact that he could not possibly care less about you. And when you die and go to the equivalent of goblin heaven, he's going to use you as fodder in his eternal war against other abyssal deities. So it's a situation where I think that sort of feeds into this weird inferiority complex and need to overcompensate that goblins have.
Yes, and that feeds into my next point about why the kobolds' racial abilities also feed well into their thing, which is that, as mentioned, their god actually does care about them. I would say, even from what I've read on him, there's a very good section in Volo's Guide about him, that the god, whose name I also cannot pronounce, is very interested in actually seeing the kobolds live up to their full potential, and you really see that he's willing to do anything and make sure that they survive. Kobolds are very much built to survive, where goblins are built to destroy. You know, there's a very important difference there, and that ability is cower and hide, I believe, or something like that. Yes, grovel, cower, and beg, which allows them to use their action to cower pathetically to distract nearby foes, and until the end of their next turn, their allies gain advantage on an attack while their enemy is focused on the kobold. They cannot use this until after a short or long rest after they've used it once, which, again, really shows they're so thoroughly built around survival. Similarly, pack tactics have the ability whereby it's basically flanking, but written into the rules in a non-variant kind of way. And so I actually really like that, because we've had many disputes about flanking. But it really shows, again, their strength is in numbers, and where goblins are surprisingly organized, there are surprisingly more kobolds. So there's always another kobold.
Yes. Now we're going to go into what classes make sense to play with goblins and kobolds. These are just suggestions. Of course, you can do whatever you would like. With kobolds, they get a dexterity bonus of 2. They have dark vision. They have the pack tactics, as mentioned. Unfortunately, they have sunlight sensitivity, which is certainly not my favorite of all the game mechanics. It makes them less suitable for things like Barbarian or Fighter or any other melee class, really, just because of the disadvantage. But if you notice with pack tactics, if you have 2 kobolds in a party, it cancels it out. So there's ways around it, and of course if you can work out with your DM what constitutes direct sunlight and find ways in-game to keep the kobold out of direct sunlight, there you have it and there you are. I also just love the idea of a kobold fighter who's hacking his way through swarms of enemies and then at the right moment starts grovel cowering begging so that his allies have advantage on their attack rolls. I just feel like that has a tremendous amount of flavor potential. As mentioned, kobold sorcerers are a thing. Kobolds, while they reach maturity at 6 years old, they can live to be up to 120 years old. So there's certainly the potential for a kobold who was maybe hiding in some library in the Underdark and sneaking in and reading arcane texts and just quietly gathering this knowledge for decades. Maybe even with the rest of his warren, not knowing. And now this kobold is ready to pursue a life of adventure as a wizard with his arcane knowledge. So that's certainly a great possibility. Mara played an excellent kobold bard that was a really fun and interesting character. Now, as far as goblins go, again, fighter types actually do make more sense with goblins. They have dark vision, but they do not have the sunlight sensitivity, so they don't have that hindrance. They have the nimble escapes, which allows them to disengage or hide as a bonus action on any of their turns. And as mentioned, they have Fury of the Small, which is a really neat ability, I think, to go with a rogue. Because you have, especially an assassin rogue, you sneak in, you get that hit, you get your sneak attack damage, you get your Fury of the Small damage. So they can just do this really dramatic hit in sort of keeping in with the lore, with the somewhat legendary cowardice of the goblins. They make that one big hit, haha, I got you, and then they just bail, they run away. With goblins, one of the things that hinders them is that their maximum age is actually 60 years, but they very rarely live to be that old. So even for something like a warlock, they don't have a long enough lifespan to necessarily be appealing to any entity that would grant them that kind of power. Now, I played in a Weeby Goblins campaign, an adaptation from a Pathfinder thing. I played a Hexblade Goblin who basically he had been in a battlefield and just there was so much death around him that it wound up giving him a connection to the Shadowfell. Even he didn't understand it. That was a really fun and interesting and atypical kind of character to play. Mara, what are some thoughts you have about appropriate classes for these guys?
Well, first off, I'd like to address that lifespan thing just real quick. One of the new class additions, I forget which book it's in, possibly Sword Coast's Guide, is the Undying Warlock, which doubles your lifespan at lower levels, and then at level 20 you just become immortal, and that's fairly high level, it's level 10 and such. So if you are one of the 10% of players who has a long-running campaign going and actually continues to play it, I would highly recommend that you perhaps spec into that just a little bit so that your goblin doesn't accidentally die one day because you forgot how old he was. But going on with the classes, kobolds, I think, while they do have some interesting features, especially that dexterity score increase of 2, so you could definitely play a rogue. I personally love the idea of something like a monk who is a kobold, because that is just kind of a ridiculous picture to me, is, oh, wow, that's a big lizard right there, and it just punched me 7 times, and I'm dead now. Or the fact that they can run on air, it's a way of giving the kobold that magic without necessarily ruining it, because, again, kobolds aren't really supposed to have magic 9 times out of 10, so it allows you to stay within the race's features without at the same time compromising it. And they do have some potential as wizards, I'd actually say, just because that sunlight sensitivity is so severe that if you don't have allies who... If you have allies who are low health or something, then having a kobold wizard actually makes a lot of sense, because they get disadvantage on attack rolls and wisdom checks, which means that DC saving throw spells are just fine for them. So again, any kind of spellcaster, just take the DC spells. They're objectively better than the attack rolls anyway. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. And I've actually played as the before-mentioned Kobold Bard. Sadly, I don't clearly remember him right now, but I also did play a Kobold fighter who dual-wielded shields. I think I might have mentioned him in the past. He's kind of legendary for me. He had an armor class of 24, and he was multi-classed fighter, dual-wielder, so he could dual-wield the shields, and he could do 2d4 of damage. So it was one of those things where it was a bit of a gimmick character, but at the same time, he was completely indestructible and actually did do pretty significant damage per turn. So there are definitely some very fun ways to do it, and even though they're kind of a gimmicky race, you can definitely get the fullest experience out of it.
So goblins also get the dex bonus of 2, and their constitution score increases by 1. I hadn't really thought about it, but for either race, kobolds are between 2 and 3 feet tall, goblins are between 3 and 4 feet tall. You're absolutely right. A potential for either of them as a monk is kind of hilarious. I mean, you could have a character whose whole thing is that they run around kicking people in the shin until they die, which seems like the most goblin thing ever. I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of flavor. One thing that is, I will always and forever advocate for Session 0, and in this case what you're going to do at Session 0, whether you're a DM running something like We Be Goblins, or whether you're a player who wants to play a goblin or a kobold, is you want to just make sure that you have an understanding of where they fit in the world they're playing, because if you're going to be arrested at every town you go to, or if it's a kill-on-sight relationship that the goodly races have, you'll need to know that, and you'll need to play and tailor the campaign accordingly. When I DM'd a homebrew version of We Be Goblins, I made a homebrew world in which humans actually did somewhat trade with goblins for roots and berries and things in the goblin swamp that the humans needed for things like spell components and potions. So there was somewhat of a relationship there, and that made the campaign run much smoother. It gave it a little bit less of a dark feel. But you can do whatever you want. It's your game. Just make sure that everybody at the table is aware of what's going on before you get into it, so there's no unpleasant surprises, nobody trying to do anything that didn't work. I will say, the first time I played a We Be Goblins game, our party did come upon a half-elf soldier, and my character decided to try to convince him that we were halflings, while another character was trying to eat his ear. It was a misunderstanding that led to a great moment of roleplay, and that can happen sometimes, and it's fun when it does. Mara, what's the last you have to say?
Last few things I have to say is, with the kobolds, it's very similar again. Be sure to tell your DM about it, especially with that nasty sunlight sensitivity. I think it's almost worse than goblins in a way, just because that disadvantage is so crippling if you're not doing it right. And I will also point out, for those of you who do not want to deal with it at all, or even have the discussion with your DM, that umbrellas are 2 gold pieces for some reason. But continuing on, we hope you did like this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe for more. Maybe even leave a comment on your favorite experiences with kobolds and goblins, and the next video we'll likely be on our take on homebrew. So